Awesome. Thanks. So just got a few slides today to take you through some tactics, but feel free to stop me along the way or save your questions for at the end, or even put them in the chat as they come up and Neil will ask them to me at the end. Does that sound good? All right, cool. So like Neil said, my name is April Mills. I run a blog called Engine for Change, which has been around now for a decade. Started the blog because honestly, I got sick of telling the same stories to the same people over and over again. So I thought, well, why don't I just write them down once and then I can share them with folks. And so that started the blog, which started the consulting, which ultimately led through an interesting turn of events into the book that Neil mentioned. And now this, my second book. So excited to be here to share it with you today. So we're all going through this virus crisis at the moment. But as I was thinking about coming in today, I wanted to start by sharing a story about a personal crisis I went through back in 2016. Almost exactly 4 years ago this week, I was hosting a conference called Accelerate Results. And after that conference, the organization I was with announced a major layoff. And a few weeks later, I had lost my job. I had 2 months to find a new job. And a week after that, my son here, Theodore, went into the hospital with a major infection. There was an infection in a shunt, which he has to deal with his special needs. And the infection was quickly racing to his brain. So for 2 weeks, I sat up on the hill in Portland in Dornbecker Children's Hospital while I waited for the medicines that he was on to work. I'd never been quarantined in one room with an 8-year-old before. And here I was, a letter that said 2 months to find a new job or you can go, and a whole world I'd never expected just a few weeks earlier. And amidst that confinement, what I chose to do to keep my mind busy, to keep myself from going insane watching the Disney Channel 18 hours a day, was write my first book, Everyone is a Change Agent. That's the one that Neil was mentioning. And I've actually made it available for free for all of you at the link there at the bottom, smashwords.com. Just use that coupon code and you'll get these slides afterwards as well. I share that story with you of the crisis I was going through in 2016 because it taught me that out of crisis can come many outcomes: connection, growth. And what it brought me was a realization that I needed to shift the way I was sharing the messages I'd been talking to folks for then 6 years, more than 6 years, about change, to scale from conversations in person and small classes to a book which could scale globally. And I start with that story for us today because I think we're all struggling through challenges of how do we leverage this crisis, use this crisis to understand how we can come out the other side better. It'll make us different, whether we like it or not. But will it be a better different, a growing different, an understanding different? Or will it wear us down? And I encourage you from the other side of a crisis to lean into this moment, to come out the other side, that better different, so that you can grow and improve your outcomes. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Because amidst the crisis, many of us end up worried, what if what we've always done stops working? Being in the office, compelling others to change, all the different tactics we've used in the past often relied on us being present or us being able to get to be present, to travel, to connect in a very in-person way. From us. So what can we do? Well, first we have to look at, is what we've always done not working anymore? And I would argue that for years, this trend has started, but now it's coming to a huge pivot point, which is the traditional way we create change in organizations is no longer working. And this is the graphic which illustrates the lesson I learned years ago of how to create change. That's me holding the whip, forcing others to make the change happen. It's the story of the first time I took on program management. I was told, make people get up this mountain or else, and I complied. And I had my Excel spreadsheet, and I had my Outlook meeting notice, and I was going to make them go up this mountain. And many of you are laughing and nodding on the video, right? This is what we do. We compel others to change. We use coercion, threats to force them forward into the change we've created for them. And here are 3 tactics we often use that I'd argue are not working anymore. And especially not working now that we've removed that physical presence, which we often use to compel the change. Let me give you 3 examples here. Let's work through these. So the first, change enforcement, right? Where we use our presence to ensure that people change. Many of you have probably done this where you do the walking around to check to make sure, are they really doing what I want them to do? The hovering. Anybody a hoverer who hovers a little bit behind people to check and see, are they going to do it if they notice I'm here? Right? You pull people in the conference room, make sure they're complying. All these ways where we use our physical presence to compel others to change have now been eliminated from our arsenal. And I'm going to share with you in a minute a better way. But this one clearly is one that if it was working in the past, that sort of threatening, looming, here comes April to get you tactic, that we don't like when others do it to us, but we've been doing it to others, can and should stop after this crisis. The next one isn't about stopping, but it is realizing the limits of what we're trying to get change management to do for us. Many of you might have had a long plan of what you were going to do to make the change happen, to compel others to change, to ensure that they're doing it as you've assigned it. And how many of those plans are out the window right now? Because they were instructor-led training, meetings after meetings, looking people in the eye. I'm getting really close, right? Do it or else. Maybe you can do it a little bit on Zoom, but who wants this all day, right? Okay. We can do better. So we've got to realize that the limits of change management, we're finding them, which is plans about what should happen in the future depend on the future happening as we planned. And so many of us are learning that the future's less, our success in the future is less about how well we plan and more about how well we adapt as things change. That's what the crisis should be teaching us. That's what I think a lot of folks were learning before this crisis, but anybody who doubted it, hopefully that's being eliminated now. And we're seeing the limits of change management for driving what we want into the world. And the last one, little bit of, sprinkles in the water here for the Agile community here, but I think we still do a ton of change waterfall, which is we wait until we've implemented something to start thinking about the change. I'm going to go design a new system. I'm going to go build a new program. I'm going to go remake an organization. And then there's like that moment where we let people in on the secret, and then they better get on board or else. How many people have done that to folks? Like sneak up on them with a major change, right? So we're going Agile in our development, but what are we doing with our change? So there's a better way. Now is the time, I'd argue, to change our tactics. because we can't continue to use coercion and threats. We no longer have the same proximity to people that we used to have. We no longer have the same job durations that we used to have, where it was like, well, I better, you know, Tim better do that for me because we're going to work together for 10 years and I'm going to remember that he didn't do it. Who does that anymore, right? You're going to be gone in 3 years. I'll be gone. You'll be gone. You know, it's not the same environment. If there was any imagining it was the same environment before this crisis, we now have that delusion ripped from us. So we can do better. So here are a few options I came up with for you today to change your tactics. And I'm sure we can come up with more scenarios and talk about more as I finish the slides. So what does it look like if we change our tactics? Well, the first thing, and this I first revealed in Everyone's a Change Agent. So this concept is out there. You can grab the book for free, check it out. It's about driving change. When you look at changes that are successful, that have been successful, chances are good you could think of one in your past that's been successful. It was when someone chose the change for themselves and cleared the obstacles for others to choose it to. Demonstrating it, role modeling it, living it, and appreciating the fact that change is challenging for everyone. But if I want to do it, I'm willing to go over the obstacles to get it. I mean, how many people here have voluntarily ran a race of any length or gone for a run of any type, right? Almost everybody. And how many of you did that in gym class in school and hated every second of it, right? But now do it to yourself and go willingly, maybe with friends. Maybe there's beer at the end, right? Maybe there's not. Who knows what you're racing for? But we willingly put ourselves in situations that are challenging, that are difficult, that push our limits if we choose them. But the same thing, if your boss said, you must go on a 5K run or else, how many of you would protest and pout until they had to come find you, right? So simple examples of how this switches and how if we choose it, we can clear the obstacles for others. A very powerful concept. I encourage you to go get the book, check it out. This is the change tactic that's already out there, but the rest of these build on it. So 3 things that you can do today to accelerate your changes given this crisis, and I'd argue these were working even before the crisis, but now it's come to a height, is the first one is focus less on your forcing the change and more on your change influence. And this one is really around where are the opportunities to use your example to make it safer to change. I'll give you a simple example. I deal with a lot of folks in organizations that say, I wish meetings ended at 5 or 10 to the hour so I had some chance to go get a coffee and get a break and not always be late. Would anybody love that in their life? To not constantly be teleporting from one meeting to the next? And I'll find a lot of folks that go, there should be a corporate policy that mandates it. But really it's open to all of us to say, in my meetings I run, they end 5 before the hour. Because I can control that. I can influence that. I can role model that. And small but significant opportunities like that are available to you every day on the changes you're trying to create, even from a distance. To say, notice. Am I back on, Neil? I can't hear you, sorry. You guys can hear me? No?
Yep.
Okay, sorry.
You're good.
All right, so every day choose to influence by role modeling it in those subtle or significant ways where even from a distance, people will notice, wow, that's different. Liz is doing that thing she mentioned last week she really wanted us to do. I'm seeing her doing that. Neil's really out there demonstrating whatever that new skill is, whatever that new expectation is. Look at him using the tool. And simple things like trying to get tool adoption up are so easy to do remotely, where if you're using the tool, have it up when the meeting starts and even do the accidental close. Oh, hold on, let me get out of that tool I was using before the meeting. And there's subtle ways, but significant ways where you can show people, I'm doing this. Because that actually helps them adopt much faster than if you were reminding them they have to. Okay, so first change tactic. The next one I want to share with you is focus on your change design more than on your change management. Here's a simple example I can give. In many projects I am still working with today and hearing about and discussing with colleagues like you, folks are talking about instructor-led training and detailed and repetitive comms to let folks know about a change happening. How many of us would tolerate constant, repetitive emails or classes we had to take on using some of the basic tools we use in our lives? We don't. The changes are meant to be ubiquitous, seamless, mostly behind the scenes if they can keep it there. If they do change a UI that we have to interface with, there's a little pop-up which says, did you know this is now this way and here's why. It's once, we can click it off, maybe we can leave it. But we're building into the design the change instead of designing it however we want and then forcing people to figure out our design later. That's a huge opportunity we all have today as we're working on things remotely, is to say, hey, hold on a second. Are we making sure we're designing to make this easy to adopt? Instead of waiting until we're done designing and pushing this project to a change manager to rah-rah people into loving or even just using my design that isn't seamless, it doesn't meet their needs, that pushes a lot of cognitive weight on them to figure it out for me, the designer. So there's probably lots of examples you have in your work today where you haven't swung that balance back to building the change into the design instead of waiting for change management to handle it later. So think about that one. And then the next one is really around change agility. And this one is changing from waiting until something's in production to let folks know, to big bang, change rollout, change reveal, and instead saying, how are we, as we show up in an agile way to ship working product and work with customers, building in some of the change concepts of, now, as you use this, how are you going to role model it? How are others going to know you're using it? As you're using it, what are some of the other things in the environment that are outside of this tool, outside of this change, that will pull you back to maybe the old way, that will pull you back to not using this new tool? Have those conversations as you're shipping your working product over the course of iterations. Don't have the conversations about functionality with the user and not adoption with the user. You're missing a huge opportunity to pull that learning up, to build a following in while you're developing, so that when you do go to scale, when you do go to production, you actually have folks who are already advocates who can be then doing the change influence, that can be celebrating your change design and create that snowball effect, which makes it easier as people are distributed to get people to voluntarily choose the change for themselves and go with you. So those are a few simple tips and change tactics I wanted to share with you today to get us started in, well, what about, and how about, and I noticed this isn't working anymore, what might I do? That I'd really like to have that conversation with you. So if you think about these as a slider scale, I built this slide just to give you as a history of it. So you've got a one slide, and Neil will share these with them right afterwards. So it's not it must not be this, it must be this. I don't like those sort of either or, but as you're looking, try to do the instead of. How can I trade out some driving people for more driving change? How can I build in some change influence instead of all change enforcement? How can I build my change into my design instead of waiting to manage it later? And how can I move to more change agility instead of that big bang change waterfall once we hit production at the end? These are some concrete changes in your change tactics you can do right now to accelerate change, even amidst the crisis, even amidst the distribution, even amidst, maybe because of that lack of physical proximity, which was probably the last bastion of making us think that driving people and forcing change was still working. It's not, and we can do better. So if you're interested in more change tactics, my book is out for special limited time pre-order now. I think there's about 12 days left on this special pre-order option. So go to the link there, publish-sizer, it's hard to say, but you can see it, .com/change tactics, and you can look at ways you can get the book or other coaching sessions or keynotes that come with it as it's published later this year. So really excited to be here with you. Really want to stay in touch. I've got a last slide which has my contact info for all of you if you want to stay connected. But I'd love to answer any questions on the content or take any of your questions about what about and how about. I'm here for you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, April.
Thanks.
If you'd like to ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself and go for it.
Hey, April, I'm curious, what's your inspiration for the like the non-coercion type of tactics?
So my inspiration was actually the lesson I learned when I tried to coerce people and it failed miserably. The story, it's in Engine for, or Everyone's a Change Agent, but I'll give you the short synopsis is that I was, gosh, what was I, 24 years old. I was a nuclear engineer for the US Navy, one of the few women nuclear engineers. I was given the task of being the project manager for a major project. And I was so excited. And I thought, man, my solution will really work. But when I tried to do what everybody else had done around me, which was use Outlook and Excel and the boss's name to make people obey me or else, it didn't work. The first time they came to my meeting because they were curious as to who this lady was that thought she could boss them around. The second time they came to tell me how wrong I was. And the third time they didn't show up and I told the boss on them. And it didn't get the outcome I wanted. And being an engineer, I had to troubleshoot it. And I said, well, what works better instead? And whether it was literature research or studying history, or then I had more opportunities to try different things. They gave me more chances to lead. What I found was worked so much more successfully and so much faster was being immersed in the change and putting my energy on removing obstacles in the system, which were stopping people from making the change versus pushing them forward almost into the boulders and then telling on them if they didn't jump when I said how high.
Thank you. Do you mind putting your contact info back up?
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. No problem.
April, what are some of the tactics you've used for changing policy in the past?
Tactics for changing policy. Well, actually, this one's much simpler than people think, which is most times in organizations, there are very few written policies. So there's a lot of what people think they can and can't do. So one of the key tips is to go search for the rule when somebody tells you that's against the rules. Now, sometimes I think, we've had this conversation. Sometimes when you go, well, where's the rule which says it has to be that way, or I can't do that thing I want to do? People then make up a rule and write it down and send you an email, right? And say, well, here's the rule now. But even in that situation, you really have the opportunity, once it's written down, to say, okay, I understand that. But in what conditions is this true? Is there an exception or an exemption if you see that I really need to be on the other side of that? And it's working with who's actually responsible or has the authority to change that, and how can I influence them? And I think that actually talking about policies and changes, this is a perfect time to notice the things that are going on in the world around some of those policies or practices that people took for granted, that they're starting to reconsider because they're getting in the way of rapid outcomes. And we're seeing this, whether it's with, FDA trade-offs on time and testing, whether it's shipping rules about who ships to who when and how they distribute inventory. We saw the negative aspects of poor policy or blind policy following after Hurricane Katrina, when there were many people who didn't get evacuated because there weren't vehicles to evacuate them. But then after the hurricane, there were pictures of parking lots full of school buses. And when they asked, well, why didn't you use the school buses to evacuate, say, people from old folks' homes? The answer was, well, we didn't have drivers with the right driver's license to drive the bus on nearly empty streets to save people. They chose the rule, the policy, over the outcome. And so this, I think, is a perfect time as you run up against a rule which seems to be preventing you from accomplishing the change you want, and you can make the argument for the safety trade-offs, the outcome trade-offs, to challenge it with the people who own or manage that rule, to say, how can we? What would it look like if? And then put your idea down in writing and put it in front of them so it becomes an option, an intentional option. And when I've done that, I've usually found if I can't get immediate success, I can at least get more information, which allows me to then do an iteration to say, okay, who else could I influence? How can I improve what I'm asking for? How do I better understand the situation so I can build a better policy? I've had great success with that. Does that help?
Yeah, that's terrific. Thank you.
Awesome.
Anybody else have questions? I'm not seeing any in the chat.
April, do you have any specific tactics for managing change when folks are very unfocused, like right now?
Yeah, so great question. I think one of the first things to do is to look at how many things are we asking them to change simultaneously. Oftentimes as change agents, we're really only focused on my change, not their portfolio of changes. I mean, if you think about today, there are so many folks who are trying to figure out how do I do the job I did yesterday, given the new tool set. So they're learning a new tool set potentially. They're learning, how do I manage my workday and children at home? They're learning, how do I manage, I love the things that are online, like I didn't know my spouse was the guy, the gal who walks around and is like, okay, 5 more minutes. Right? I mean, we're learning a lot and adapting a lot to a lot of different things going on. So the first thing I would say is being able to appreciate what's the span of changes they're going through. And then on the side you can control is how do you reduce the cognitive load? How do you reduce the change burden of what you're asking for? So maybe you're not going to ask for 10 things today, but what's the one? And how can you role model doing that one? And then ask them to join you in doing it. So you can talk about, and I can give an honest example. I'm working with a team and we're working really hard on our Kanban practices because we each have a to-do list and now we're not together and we have too much whip and we're not getting a ton done. And so we're working through and intentionally saying we all need to work on focusing on our Kanban practices so that we are consistent, connected, and accomplishing. But we had to narrow it down to that and say, of all the things, let's focus on this one, because then this one becomes how we can get more done. So those are some things I would do to help folks focus on your change, or at least get some progress on it and feel like they're not having to focus on it, which is probably that secret spot. Is that helpful?
Yeah, would you say small incremental change is easier for folks to deal with right now?
I'm going to use the classic consultant thing, is it depends. If you were going to give me, little bits of something where really I don't really understand it until I get the whole, that might feel like you're trying to be nice, but you're just confusing me. So I think you really almost need to do the honest ask with folks, which is, look, hey, we're hoping to get these 10 things done. I was thinking I'd start with one. What would be easier for you, to roll out the 10 in a bunch, or to do this one? And how representative do you think your answer is to the group? Maybe if it's a bigger group. I think it's going to vary. Some people are going to be like, just give me all 10. I just want to get it over with. Other people are going to be like, please don't give me any. And we're going to have to work a lot of grace. But I think there's a huge opportunity to learn your teammates better, to learn your systems better, and to be more successful not only with this change, but future changes, if you'll pay attention to those aspects.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
This is Andy. I have a question for you.
Yep.
I was wondering if you can give us an example, or have you run into the situation where you'd be working with a team that's looking for a change? Say you're working with a development team that needs to go through change in order to work more efficiently. You have a good consensus with the team itself, but for some reason the management or the executives that really own that process, so the ones that can actually make the change, are not as amenable to the change, despite showing evidence of how the change can be beneficial, having actual commentary from the people that are working that actually say, yes, this is good. I mean, have you run into that sort of situation where, despite you have all the sort of pieces in order to show that it's helpful, but you can't quite move it? What are some things you've done in those situations?
Yeah, great question. So let me make sure I heard it right. So you've got a team on board, but maybe the management or the executive doesn't get it or isn't on board, and how do you help them see it so you can make the change successful? Did I catch it right?
Exactly, thank you.
Yeah. So one of the concepts that's in my first book, Everyone is a Change Agent, is this concept of a change buffer. And so oftentimes when you're having something new, when you're introducing it into an environment, it's not just going to stand up tall and strong on its own and be able to exist without a little help. And so I use the analogy of an island of new in a sea of status quo. And in order to protect that little island of new, you have to build this change buffer around it, this wall that can protect it until it's strong enough to sustain on its own. And so one of the ways you do that with the leaders is you can help them see, using this term change buffer, that they actually are a vital part in amplifying and protecting the good work that the team is doing. So you almost complement them into supporting you, which is, I'm really grateful that you've got such a great team that's really embraced this change. And I really just wanted to help you realize the important role you play as a leadership buffer, which protects this fledgling change and these good outcomes you're getting from the status quo. Now that's one step, but it could be that there's something in that manager or that executive's environment which actively encourages them to actually prohibit this change from happening. And maybe you've seen this before where you're rewarded for utilization of the team, and you start doing agile practices and they get more done in less time, and so utilization drops and people think that's bad, and then they try to load the team up and then they're like, wait a second, I thought we got to negotiate what we do and get better, and so it becomes this vicious cycle of sort of the old measures fighting the new practices. So in those cases, working with the manager and the executive, it's your role to help them see almost the miswires, right? Where I'm noticing that this old measure is actually getting in the way of this new behavior sustaining. How can we partner to remove that? Who could I help you influence to change that? Or get, back to Neil's point, get a policy statement which says this group is actually exempted from that measure because they're getting this result without that measure. So you can really play with this concept of the change buffer to say, how can I almost push the walls of the status quo back to give that team room and to enroll then that manager or that executive onto this island of the change so that they're helping keep that at bay. How was that?
That's very helpful. Gives me a couple ideas and some folks I can work with that. So thank you.
Awesome.
Any other questions?
Right.
Yeah, it's very quiet this morning. It's an early morning. April, I'm thinking about another situation where someone asks you to do something that is duplicate or triplicate work, and you're trying to figure out what's the best way to, without flat out telling them this is not a good idea, maybe help them think through what they're trying to get from that situation.
Yeah, so oftentimes in those situations, it's really helpful to lay out. You can use a tactic that's in my first book, which is called Change Perspectives and Dissolve Resistance. And lay out for them, it's a 2x2 matrix, positives and negatives of changing, positives and negatives of not changing. Those of you who do theory of constraints, they call this, right, the change matrix. And what you're doing when you lay that out is to say, look, from my perspective, this policy change, here are the positives of it that I think you're going after. Did I get those right? Here are the negatives of it as it's impacting me. It's actually tripled my work in this space, because maybe they don't know that. A lot of times people are ignorant of the consequences of their change. They're not intentionally tripling your work. Here are the positives I see in not changing. But maybe here are the negatives I think you're saying that you see if we don't change. Did I capture that right? And you can use that sort of 2x2 as a start to the conversation. Because people like to correct the record. So if you say, I think this is what it is, did I get that right? And you put yourself in that vulnerable, what Edgar Schein calls one down position, to go, I might be wrong, so help me. People like to help in that case. They like to correct. And so they're more likely to give you that feedback of, here's what I was going after, here's what I wanted. Now, depending on how open the person is to that conversation, you'll get more transparent answers than others. But a lot of these tactics are about controlling how you can show up and shape the conversation, not how you can make them show up as open, as vulnerable, as transparent as you are. You can't control that. But you can show up in a way which says, I'm going to create a space where if you want to be open and transparent and think about this together, here's where we can do that. So that's what I would encourage you to do. And then you have to act on what you learn, which is, given what I know now, what can I do? And this is the change agent's motto, again, and everyone's a change agent, is what can I do with what I have where I am? Which means we can't control everybody. We can't make everybody change, but how can I clear the obstacles for them with what I have so they can join me, or I can join them and I can understand better.
I have a question.
Yes, Jean. Hi, good morning.
Good morning. So for those of us who've read your book, could you give us some insight into what's coming in the next one? What we'll find there that isn't in the first book?
Yeah, so part of what drove me to write this next book is that there's so many more tactics that I think folks can use on a day-to-day basis that build on the foundation from everyone as a change agent, that build on that foundation of driving change, that I really wanted to just fill the world with more options. Because when we're stressed, when we're frustrated, when we're confused, we go back to what we've always done. And unfortunately, the driving people options, there weren't many to begin with. And those that are there aren't working as well. They weren't working before, but now with the crisis, they're really not working. And they're caustic and damaging. So I thought this was really the best opportunity to really just flood the readers that were hungry for options with more options for what you could do if you were living and driving change. And I've gathered up a ton of them over the course of the past 10 years, and things like a rubric for actually assessing competence to build trust, to drive faster decisions. That's one of the tactics that'll be in there. That would have taken the whole hour. That's why I didn't give you that one today, just to go into that one tactic. But things like that are going to be in there where it's practical, it's implementable, it's scalable, and it fills your driving change toolbox out much more than I could in the introductory book.
So actually in that example, you say it's assessment of ability to build trust. Is it an assessment of the relationship, the change agent, or the party that they're working with to move the change forward?
You can use it in multiple different ways. So what the assessment takes you through is 3 competencies, a technical competence, a business acumen or a situational awareness competence, and then a change competence. And says, given these areas with these specific attributes, am I a novice, am I learning, or am I competent? And I can do that for myself and ask my manager to do it, and then have a conversation about how much I should be able to act and notify versus have to bring my conclusions to the boss for permission. Many of you are probably dealing with, I would just like to get stuff done instead of having to wait for a meeting to ask my boss, may I do the thing I already know is right? If you're going through that right now, this is going to be a key tactic for shrinking those durations. But you can also, if depending on the transparency and the vulnerability you're willing to show with your boss, have a conversation of with the manager, especially a new manager, if you're a more seasoned employee in that group, to say, hey, I want to do this assessment with you. I want you to assess me, but I also want permission to assess you. So I can help you be your best self in this new environment. Because I've seen a ton of executives or senior leaders that come into organizations and they know technically what to do, but they lack the situational awareness for what works and what doesn't at this company. Not to restrict their options, but to help them place themselves in space. And then often, maybe this is just my lens, but I see a ton of folks who just have the right ideas, might have the right business acumen, but struggle to make change happen because they drive people. And so if anything, you can also use it in the space of affirming their technical competence, affirming their situational awareness, and saying, now let me help you become a better change agent because I see your passion. I see what you want to get done. But those change tactics aren't working anymore. And so you can use it multiple ways. I've also seen teams, Jean, who've used it team to team and said, do I trust the input coming in from that team or not based on these assessments? Or are they not trusting my data because there's a gap, and let me go check by letting them assess me? So it's a pretty powerful tactic.
It does sound like it is. So that's one example. About how many do you expect to have? How many different tactics do you expect to have in the book?
Oh, Jean asked the best questions. I'm shooting for more than 10. We'll see how fast and furious my pen goes for whether or not it's a multiple of that or slightly more. But I want it to be meaty enough where you feel like you got a good amount of info, but I don't want it to be so big that you feel like now I have so many options. If anybody's heard the scenarios of the danger of 401ks when they give you like 4 options, 60 or 70% of people will pick from the 4. When it goes up to like 9 options, 30 or 20% pick, because it's too many options, so I seize up. So I'm trying to hit that sweet spot in there, and still in development, but maybe they'll have to be volume 2 for those of you who are hungry for more but don't want to be overwhelmed. We'll see.
If no one else has a question, I have yet another one.
Go ahead.
For those of us who've read Linda Rising, and I can't remember her co-author on Fearless Change, are you familiar with that book? And can you contrast this one with that one?
You know, I don't think I've read it recently enough, Jean, to do it justice. So unfortunately, I'm aware of it, but I can't remember it enough to comment this morning on it.
I believe it's a patterns-based compendium with a little theory in it.
Cool. I'll check it out. Thanks.
Any other questions? Looks like Ali asked in the chat, Jean, are you referring to the fearless change patterns?
Yes, that's it. With the white
Okay.
and light blue cover.
He's posted a link to the Amazon for the book. So
Awesome.
if anybody wants to check that one out, go for it. One that I don't have in my library. So.
Did anybody come forward with a scenario? If not, I can also provide a scenario that April and I have been discussing offline.
Go ahead, Jean.
Okay, April and I will be co-presenting this morning.
Yes.
So April, it's a situation I'm dealing with in my neighborhood, which was a very quiet neighborhood until quite recently. And suddenly we've got a new neighbor who's been here about a year, who's always been a little bit of a noise problem. Well, in the last few weeks, he's gotten a lot louder. And then the house a couple houses down got a lot louder. Then a couple nights ago, people decided, well, I can run my chainsaw whenever I want. And as a very tired person, my response is, read the noise ordinance.
Yeah.
Escalate to calling the police. But when you think about it, what we've got is a new person in the environment who's asserting a change that makes sense to them, and they're modeling that change. And other people are saying, you know, I always thought about being loud at 9 o'clock at night. So how come I don't just go ahead and do that?
Yep.
So I may well be driving change with the noise ordinance, the cops. What else can you suggest?
Yeah, well, I think that's where, in a lot of cases, and this is a pattern you see repeated in places, is in times of crisis, and often some people just their whole life, maybe they go through life with sort of a bubble of they notice what impacts them and they don't notice what impacts others, right? And so you're often in those community situations calibrating those reactiveness or responsivenesses to other people. And it sounds like you're having to go through one of those recalibrations right now, right? A lot of people are recalibrating their life for where they get their input, their stimulus, their socialization, their sense of productivity, their sense of how they fit in the world and how they interact. So I think this is the right time for folks to show up and say, understand there's a lot of change going on, understand you're probably trying to figure out how to make that all make sense for you, but here are boundaries that as a community we stay within. And I think asserting those boundaries of the community that are common and shared, it feels uncomfortable when we do it, but if we don't assert those boundaries, we get these spirals of what destructive behaviors, destructive to the community behaviors, that wouldn't necessarily take off if folks were aware of the boundaries. Now, awareness of the boundary does not mean compliance with the boundary. My husband's actually a prosecutor, so I deal frequently with folks who say, I see that there's a law and I'm not going to follow that, right? So laws don't actually prevent people from doing things. They just show where the line is once people decide to cross it. So what you're doing in the space of asserting the boundaries, making sure people are aware of the boundaries, and then enforcing the boundaries is really important. But there's probably also an aspect of connection with the folks of, you know, how's it going for you as being part of this crisis? What are some of the changes you've been going through? Here are some of the changes I've been going through and how I'm coping. How can we come up with a way where your coping and my coping don't conflict? And I think we're seeing the opposite of that a lot online, where people are saying, who's planting things right now? No one should plant. And some people are like, oh my gosh, if I can't get my hands dirty and get outside, I'm going to go insane. So I need something to do. And so there's a lot of needing to show grace, but grace within boundaries, right, Jean? And the ordinance is the boundaries. So I think grace within boundaries would be a great tagline for what we're trying to go after.
And I suppose the timing of my conversation and my own competency might be a consideration. Say 9 o'clock at night, 10 o'clock at night, I will be able to manifest no grace.
Right. And that's usually what happens is we're in a stress state and then we're trying to be our best self and it doesn't work. So that's where the cops, I think they're more used to, you know, showing up whenever. But I think that's a good conversation around the community of how are we adapting given now that we're all together and all of people's energy is together. How is that changing how we show up and what can we do about it? It might be an opportunity for those who are like-minded to come together, not in an adversarial situation against the others, but to say, let's talk about how we set up this community now that this is the pattern.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks. And I wish you much sleep and quiet, my friend.
Oh, dear Lord, yes.
All right. Well, as we are getting to close to 5 minutes to the hour, I want to kind of wrap up now and thank April for coming and sharing some of those tactics, and we'll look forward to the book that's coming out soon. If you want to pre-order, remember that there is a link to publishizer.com, change-tactics, where you can go and pre-order a book. Also, check out the meetup.com site for Agile PDX. There's lots of events that are happening virtually that you can participate in. And we're pointing to other events as well. So if you find yourself looking for something to do to connect in this social distancing, it's actual physical distancing. We're trying to promote physical distance as opposed to social distance.
Yeah.
So stay social, be online, participate with other people, but maintain the physical distance to keep us all from catching this virus that's going around. And we'll look to see you on another virtual event soon.
Bye.
Bye, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
We'll post the recording and the chat and the slides in a little bit on Slack and on, we'll try and put the recording up on YouTube.
Awesome.
Great. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, April.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.